This is a 2006 M3 Coupe, 6-speed manual transmission, last year S54, and the rod bearing should be replaced every 60,000 miles. This one has just under 62,000 miles. We're upgrading the bearings to the BE bearings, and we're upgrading the rod bolts to ARP. This is the nice stuff. If you guys remember the last video, we did the full suspension, and that was at my original store, Elite Motorworks. This is the brand new store of Elite Motorworks. We got Burke working on it. You guys probably have not seen him before. He's our BMW tech here. And you guys remember Joey from the last shop, and he's now working over here. Before we get too far along, we're going to protect the fenders with some blue plastic wrap, and then we're going to get the engine support on here, get the engine hanging, and lower the subframe and get going. Those extra long, non-marring sockets are pretty nice. Ooh, look at those struts. Almost like somebody just did that.
Somebody who cared. No fingerprints on them, nothing.
As you guys can tell, we are at my brand new facility, Elite Motorworks of Lakewood Ranch. This is a brand new place, and we've got a great team here. In fact, we have a Ferrari master tech that works here, so all of our Ferrari work comes here. You're going to see a lot more stuff coming in the future. Let's get back to work.
You notice the power steering is leaking from the line that goes from the reservoir to the cooler, which is this line right here. You see the line underneath of it is wet, but I think it's just residual coming down, and you know, gravity, it's resting on that line. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna clean the lower one, but we're gonna go ahead and replace the reservoir and both the lines that come off the reservoir, which one line goes here to the pump and the other one goes to the reservoir, or goes to the cooler. And the reason we replace the reservoir too is because there is a filter built into the reservoir that can't be serviced separately. So when we pull the oil pan down, you don't have to pull this plate off, but we're going to go ahead. There's a gasket in there, so while we're in there, we're going to go ahead and take the gasket and get that replaced. We're going to replace the gasket on the oil level sensor. There is a dipstick tube that comes down. There's a little O-ring inside of there. We're going to get that replaced as well, because when we put it all back together, you've disrupted all those seals. You don't want it to leak, so we're going to go ahead and put all new seals and gaskets in there.
In the last video, you guys might have heard me talk a little bit about culture. Well, what plays into that is teamwork. So often you guys will see multiple people working on one car because everybody helps each other out. I'm sure you guys have heard the quote from JFK, "A rising tide lifts all boats," and that's the philosophy that we live by. I know I introduced Burke earlier in the video. He's been a BMW tech for 6 years. He recently started with us. He does a fantastic job, very detail oriented, very, very smart. It's actually funny because he is very camera shy. So when we shove a camera in his face and I tell him I need him to work on my dad's car, he gets really nervous. So watching this video back is actually pretty funny. There's a couple times to see him shaking, but what a great tech. Burke is torquing the ARP bolts, which is very different than the factory stretch bolts. If you guys don't know the difference, we're going to geek out for just a minute. I'm going to show you a clip from a previous video that talks about the differences. If you guys have already seen it, no problem. Just skip to the next chapter.
Before we talk about how to use a stretch gauge, it's first important to know the difference between a torque to yield bolt, the factory bolt, and the ARP bolt. When you think about bolts, not just torque to yield bolts, but all bolts, when you tighten them down, they actually elongate. So if you imagine like a spring, you tighten it down and the bolt gets long. You loosen that bolt and you take it out, it shortens up again. So that's what's happening. Obviously, I'm exaggerating quite a bit here, but on a torque to yield bolt, these are designed to stretch, and they stretch quite a bit. So these have a 3-stage torquing sequence. From BMW, tighten it down to 5 Newton meter. I'm going to use this as a demonstration. This is not from the M3. This is from a different vehicle. It's simply just for demonstration purposes. So you would tighten these bolts down to 5 Newton meters, and then you're going to tighten it again to 30 Newton meters, and then you're going to go 105 degrees, right? Then you back it off and you do it again, and then you back it off and you do it one more time. There's 3 stages of doing that, and the reason they do that is because that is how you achieve the maximum tensile strength from the torque to yield bolts. A lot of times you'll hear me call them stretch bolts, torque to yield bolts, same thing. The ARP bolts are not torque to yield bolts. They do not stretch like they do, so they don't require the multiple stages of torquing. Instead, they give you one torque sequence and they want you to measure the stretch. They have an optimal stretch that they want you to achieve to give you the maximum clamping force. And in this case, it's 7.5 thousandths to 8 thousandths. Now, if you want to think about how much that actually is, A human hair is about 2.5 thousandths. Essentially, they want it to stretch about the same thickness of 3 human hairs. Unless you're my Aunt Sally, then that's about 1 human hair. I don't know what ARP uses in their bolts. It is a super unobtainium type of metal, and it is harder than woodpecker lips. This stuff is amazing. This is why people go with the high performance bolts, is because of the upgraded metals that they use and how much better this is than the factory bolts. Okay, now that we've talked about the differences in bolts, we're gonna show you how to use the stretch gauge. Now that you know that we're using the stretch gauge for just the performance bolts, but not the factory bolts. In fact, if you look at the 2 bolts and the differences, the factory bolt does have a little divot here, but this one has an intentional divot right there. You flip them over, and again, an intentional divot. This one is more of a domed edge. The reason these divots are here are specifically for this gauge. Once you've done your tightening, for my car in the application, it is 50 foot-pounds. You'll tighten it to 50 foot-pounds, and then you're going to measure it with the gauge. So imagine the piston in the cars up here. You have the cylinder. Obviously you can't get this gauge up in there, so that's why this is really long. You're gonna sneak this past. You're gonna get this in here like that. And then the pin up here is going to go right into that divot of that bolt. So basically it's going right into this pin right here. So now that it's centered right in the middle of that bolt, we can see, we're gonna kind of center it up here like that. Okay, we're gonna get our gauge centered. We're gonna turn this until we get to 0. Now, I've already used these little marks. This is how much we want the bolt to stretch. So we would torque this down to 50 Newton meters, and then we would measure it again. If we measure it again and the gauge, let's say instead of this being up here where we need it to be, I'm sorry, this is really hard to do. Instead of being there or so, let's say it's right here. It's not quite there, so we would have to torque it down a little bit more until we achieve the maximum stretch. This is not used on all bolts all the time. In fact, they're only used on performance bolts, and a lot of times when you buy these fasteners, they will tell you that they need to be checked with a stretch gauge. It's not on all bolts, definitely not on factory bolts. So the reason they go with the stretch instead of a torque sequence, because if you tighten every bolt to 50 foot-pounds, let's say, it's not gonna have the same clamping load. It's not gonna be even. If you go and check them, they're all gonna be different. So that's why they want you to check the stretch of the bolt, because that's gonna give you the maximum tensile strength, just like the torque to yield bolts. I will tell you guys, there's a huge black wormhole of information out there that you can get into. Thermal expansion and certain different types of metals and lubricants, and oh my gosh, it goes on and on and on. I am not that guy. I'm not the science professor that's gonna talk to you about that stuff. I'm just a guy touching on the subject. In fact, I'm still learning about some of this stuff. It is insane how much information is out there. Okay, what we want to do is I was very curious, as Joey and I were discussing it. He had a really good idea to measure the actual torque to yield bolt. So this one is one we took out of my car, and this is a brand new one. How much did this stretch compared to this one? Now keep in mind, when this is tightened, it'll actually be stretched more. So this is unloaded stretch. So we'll see how much it's stretched just sitting like this compared to a brand new one that has not been installed yet. Okay, so it doesn't have the little divots, so we're gonna do our best to center the bolt here. Let's go ahead and zero our gauge. Okay, it's about where we need to be. So now let's take this back out. This is the brand new one, and this is the one we took out of the car. We are 25 thousandths difference from the original one. That is a huge number. Consider that the gauge goes from here to here with the ARP bolts, right? You just want to go from here to here. The factory ones, and remember, this is not even installed. This is just out here. When it's installed, it's stretched more, but just sitting here, not installed, it goes from here all the way to here at 25, it looks like, oh, maybe not quite 25, 22, 23 thousandths of a difference. That is huge when it comes to bolt stretch. All right, enough talking about bolts. Let's get back to the car.
It seems like every time I post a video about doing rod bearings on a BMW M3, we get a lot of comments of people wondering why we're doing rod bearings. It's actually a preventative maintenance for the BMW M3s. It's really common for them to fail. I think it's because they have a lot tighter tolerances. So about 60,000 miles is the time that you want to replace them. If you go beyond that, they start to really wear down and you could potentially spin a bearing. Everybody knows that BMWs commonly leak oil. Well, there's a particular part on this oil pan, if you don't put sealant between the front timing cover and the engine block, that'll definitely cause a leak. So this right here just kind of fills that seam. It's kind of funny, you see Burke shaking there. That's his nervousness on camera. As we're putting everything back together, it's also going to get new engine mounts. I mean, why not? It's right there. It doesn't take any more time. Earlier, I had talked about teamwork. Well, what's happening off camera is Joey is doing a lot of the cleaning while Burke is assembling everything. So including the oil pan that Burke just installed, Joey cleaned that. Joey's also cleaning all the under panels and the aluminum reinforcement plate. And I'll tell you what, that thing looks brand new. Can't wait for you to see it. Woo-wee! Wow, look at that thing. That is so clean. Now, obviously, this is something that not everybody's going to see, but we know it's clean. And of course, you too, because you guys got to see it. My dad has been wanting to get this car dialed in ever since he got it, and I'm so glad that we're able to finally get this thing driving like it's brand new again. We're going to plan some road trips here real soon. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure to hit that thumbs up. That really helps me out in the algorithm. See you guys next time.